When I was a little boy, sometimes I got sick. Oh, I don't mean, real sick, like going to the hospital sick. But sometimes I'd get a headache. Oh, it would hurt so bad it felt like there was a ball inside my head with spikes on it. And anytime I moved my head, that ball would just roll around inside my head. And it felt like my head was on fire. Or sometimes I'd get a sore throat. The kind where it really hurts even to swallow or to say anything. Sometimes I got this other kind of sick. My mama called it upchucking. It felt like my insides were coming out. The thing is, when I got sick like that, my mama didn't put me in the car and drive me to a doctor's office or to a minor medical center or something like that. My mama put me in bed. And after she pulled the sheet up over my chest to my chin, she'd go to the telephone and she'd call up Dr. Toole. And I'd be lying there in the quiet house, and sooner or later I would hear the sound of tires crunching on our gravel driveway outside. And I'd hear the car door slam, and I'd hear voices out in the house, and pretty soon Dr. Toole would be standing right there beside my bed, with his little doctor glasses sitting on his nose and his gray hair around his ears. And he'd put his little black bag on the edge of my bed and he'd examine me. He'd take different things out of that black bag to examine me with. Usually the first thing he'd take out was this thing that looked kind of like a flashlight, only it had a funnel on the end of it, and he'd stick that in my ear, and he'd look in my ears, and he'd look in my eyes with that. And then he'd put that back in his black bag. And then he'd take out a giant popsicle stick, and he'd say, "Open up and say, ah." And he'd lay that popsicle stick right on the back of my tongue. And if my problem was upchucking, he was treading on dangerous territory. He wouldn't put that popsicle stick back in his black bag. He'd put it in his pocket so he'd be sure never to use it again. Then he'd take out this little round metal thing with tubes that went to his ears, and he'd lay that round metal thing on my chest, and it was cold, and he'd listen to me breathe and listen to my heartbeat. And then he'd put that back in his black bag, and finally he would take out the thing I hated the most to be examined with. He'd take out a thermometer. And he'd start shaking it, and he'd look at me, and he'd say the two words that I did not want to hear. He'd say, "Roll over." See, kids today don't know what it was like getting your temperature taken when you were little back in the old days. They didn't take our temperature in our ears. No, he'd say, "Roll over." And I didn't want to, but I did. Because even as a little tiny boy, I was learning that sometimes you have to do things whether you really want to or not. One time, he took that thermometer out of his black bag and he started shaking it down, and he looked at me and he didn't say roll over. He said, "Do you think you're old enough to hold this thermometer under your tongue for a minute without biting it?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I can do that." And he stuck that thermometer in my mouth, and I held it under my tongue. I held it together with my lips. I didn't touch it with my teeth because I didn't want to backslide. If I had been in a different frame of mind, I might have thought to myself, I wonder where that thermometer has been. But I wasn't thinking about that at all. I was thinking about the fact that I was growing up. Well, after Dr. Toole had finished examining me, then he would start taking things out of his bag to make me better. And it was usually one of two things. It might have been a bottle of medicine. He'd send my mama to go get a tablespoon from the kitchen, and he'd shake up the bottle of medicine, and he'd pour it in that tablespoon, and it might be a white, chalky medicine that just tasted terrible, or it might be an orange, syrupy medicine that just tasted terrible. But I took it because I was already learning that sometimes you have to do things whether you really want to or not. And the medicine was better than the other thing he would take out of that black bag to make me better. Sometimes he would take out a shot. He'd hold up that big, long needle, and he'd say those two words that I hated to hear, roll over. And I didn't want to, but I was sick, and I was learning that sometimes you have to do things, whether you really want to or not. The thing is, when I was a little boy, sometimes we got shots when we weren't sick at all. Once a year in the spring, I had to go to Dr. Toole's office on a perfectly good day when I wasn't feeling bad at all and get my typhoid booster. My mama would pick me and my sisters up from school, and we'd go down there and get these shots. And they hurt, not just once, but twice. They hurt when the needle went in your arm, and then about an hour later, your shoulder started turning red and hot, and it hurt for about a day or two. I hated that. Well, when I was about 11 years old, my mama changed the rules. See, my older sister Patsy was driving me to school by this time, and my mama looked at us at breakfast and said, "You know, you all are old enough to get your typhoid shots without me along. Patsy, you pick up Bill after school, and the two of you go to Dr. Toole's office and get your typhoid shots." That meant I had all day to think about it. And I sat there in school thinking about ruining this perfectly good spring day with a typhoid shot, and I decided I wasn't going to get my typhoid shot. Patsy picked me up after school, and we drove down to Dr. Toole's office, and I was sitting there in his waiting room looking around just to sort of make sure my mama really wasn't there, and she wasn't. And pretty soon the nurse called us back. And the nurse said to us as we walked in the little office there with all the medical things, the nurse said, "Are you here for your typhoid shots?" And my sister Patsy said, "Yes, ma'am." And I said, "No, ma'am." And that nurse stopped and looked at me and said, "You're not going to give me any trouble, are you?" I said, "No, ma'am. I'm just not here for my typhoid shot." And then she looked at me and she said something that wasn't very smart. She said, "I tell you what we'll do. We'll give Patsy her shot first." Like watching a needle go in my sister's arm was going to make me want one too. She said, "It won't hurt," like I didn't already know that it hurt. And then she took that needle and she put it in my sister's arm, and Patsy was very brave. She stood there and took it like it didn't really hurt very much, but I was busy studying the room. And I had noticed that there was this table in the middle of the room that sometimes you sat on when the doctor was examining you. And I realized there was one nurse and me, and as long as I could keep that table between her and me, she couldn't give me the shot. So she turned around to get my shot, and I went around on the other side of the table. Well, she turned around and saw me there, and she started around the table. And I just went around the table too. And we made about 3 circles around that table. We weren't actually running. She wasn't really chasing me, It was just sort of a slow motion thing around the table about 3 times, kind of like a dance. And then she stopped. And she looked at me, and she said something smart. She said, "I don't think you're in the mood for your shot today. Why don't you come back another time?" And I was amazed. I had won against a grown-up. Until I got home, of course. And then my mama heard about all this, and she was not pleased. My mama said, "Tomorrow I'm picking you up from school, and I'm taking you to Dr. Toole's office, and you are going to get your shot." And I thought to myself, okay. And the next day, my mama did pick me up, and we went to Dr. Toole's office, and I held out my arm, and I got my typhoid shot. Because sometimes you just have to do something, whether you really want to or not. Well, as time passed, I grew up, thanks in part to all these shots I got. And during the summers when I was in high school, I got this really, really manly job. I worked for the Minnesota Outward Bound School, right up on the Canadian border. I was guiding teenagers, some of them even older and bigger than me, through the wilderness on canoe trips. I could carry a canoe over a portage all by myself. I could make fire in the middle of a driving rain. I could paddle nonstop all day in a canoe. I had this really manly job. So, when it got time to go off to college and I had a medical form to fill out, I said to my mama, "Oh, you don't need to go with me to Dr. Toole's office. I can drive myself down there and get all my shots and get everything ready for going off to college." And so I did. And it was no big problem because I was a man now. I thought I was finished, but the nurse came at me with one last needle. And it didn't have anything in it. Yet. She said, "I need to draw a little blood." And she wiped off my arm, and she said, "Now this'll stick just a little bit." And that's when I decided maybe it wouldn't be unmanly if I turned my head and sort of studied the wall over my other shoulder. And I felt that little stick, and she took some blood out, and then she put a piece of cotton on it and told me to hold my arm up, and then she said, "Now you're finished, you can go." And I stood up. And I started for the door. I took one step toward the door, and the door sort of drifted around the room a little bit. So I stepped over that way toward where the door had drifted, and it sort of drifted back. And so I stepped back toward where the door was, and the next thing I knew, I was sitting back down in that chair with my head tucked down between my knees. I had fainted. The nurse put a cold wash rag on the back of my neck. She said, "That'll be all right, that'll be all right." And I was sitting there in that chair thinking, is this the manly thing to do? She said, "It happens lots, you'll be okay." And pretty soon I was okay, and I went home. And I went off to college. Now, back in the 1960s when I went to college, the first couple of years you were there, they pretty well told you all the courses that you had to take. You didn't get much choice. And one of the courses they told me I had to take, all the freshmen at our college had to take, was ROTC. Now, I had no intention of going into the Army. I was going to be a minister. And back then, when they had the draft in the 1960s, they gave ministers a deferment. Ministers, crazy people, and felons got this deferment, and we didn't have to go into the Army. But that didn't matter. I still had to take ROTC. And I didn't mind it too much because it was fairly easy. You could make an A without too much trouble. But there was one part of it I really did mind. Every Tuesday afternoon, we had drill. We had to go out and march around the football field and the soccer fields for about an hour, and we had to be inspected and we had to be yelled at. But it wasn't just an hour, because you see, you had to polish your brass buttons in your belt buckle, and you had to spit shine your shoes, and you had to take your M1 rifle apart and clean it all out. It took all Tuesday afternoon, and I just hated it. Well, one day a friend of mine and I were walking across the campus, and there was this piece of paper tacked up to a wall. It had a red cross on it, and it said Bloodmobile. And then in the fine print underneath, where it had the date and the times, it also said, "Anyone who gives blood is exempt from ROTC drill that week." And I said to my friend, I'm going to do that. And my friend looked at me and he said, you know they use needles. I said, I don't care. I'm going to do that. He said, the last time they were here, half the football team fainted. I said, I don't care. I've done that. I'm going to give blood, and I'm going to skip ROTC drill for a whole week. And sure enough, when the bloodmobile came, I was there in line. Now, you got to understand, I was a little kid, and I looked like I was about 12 years old. And I got this nurse who took one look at me and said, oh, honey, you can't give blood. You're too young. I pulled out my driver's license and showed her I was over 18. She said, well, you don't weigh enough. How much do you weigh? I said, I weigh 115 pounds. She said, oh, honey, the limit is 110. You shouldn't give blood. I said, I've got 5 pounds over the limit. So I laid down on that cot while they put that needle in that vein, and I gave blood, and I didn't even faint. And when it was all over, they gave me a Coca-Cola to drink, and I got up, and I walked out of there, and I did not go to drill for a whole week. And every time the bloodmobile came to our campus after that, I gave blood for 2 years while I had to take mandatory ROTC. Now, my junior year, my 3rd year, I didn't have to take ROTC anymore. A friend and I were walking across campus one day, and there was that sign tacked up on the wall. It said, Bloodmobile. And my friend said, it's a good thing we don't have to give blood anymore, isn't it? And I said, yeah. But you know what? On the day of the bloodmobile, my feet didn't get the message. And they walked me right over there to that line. And I rolled up my sleeve and I gave blood. And I figure it's because I had learned. Sometimes you have to do things, whether you really want to or not, just because it's the right thing to do.